Welcome to Ghost Echo. Those who skip this video often hear whispers in the dark. To silence them, you must watch. Now put your headset on and relax.
The lonely highway stretched endlessly through an unfamiliar town, flanked by skeletal trees. The sky was heavy with thick gray clouds, swallowing the last hints of daylight. Clara Reynolds, a 32-year-old journalist, drove her aging sedan with a furrowed brow, gripping the wheel tightly. She glanced at the GPS on her phone, route recalculating. As the signal flickered, she exhaled, frustrated. Great. Just great. One wrong turn and now I'm stuck in nowhere, she muttered to herself. Her eyes flickered to the rearview mirror. For a second, she swore she saw a shadow in the back seat. Her breath hitched as she whipped her head around. Nothing. Just her overactive imagination. She sighed, shaking off the strange unease that had been gnawing at her for weeks. The strange dreams, the moments of déjà vu, the nagging feeling that something was off in her world. Then she spotted it. Up ahead, a small cemetery lay tucked behind wrought iron gates, where a funeral procession gathered in silent reverence. A priest stood by a grave, murmuring a prayer. Something about the scene drew her in. She slowed, debating whether to stop. She didn't know anyone in this town. Why would she? Yet, there was a compulsion, a pull deep in her chest. Clara parked and stepped out. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying something that almost sounded like her name. Clara, her breath caught in her throat. She looked around, but the road was deserted. She shook it off and headed toward the cemetery gates. She approached cautiously. The mourners stood in tight clusters, faces obscured by shadows, heads bowed. The priest's words were low and rhythmic, but the language was foreign, something guttural, ancient. Her gaze drifted to the casket, sitting open above the grave. It was empty. She frowned. That was odd. Stepping closer, she peered at the mourners. Their faces remained blurred, like a camera out of focus. No matter how hard she tried to concentrate, she couldn't make out their features. A shiver crawled up her spine. Then her gaze dropped to the gravestone. The moment she saw the name, her stomach lurched. Clara Reynolds born. 1992 died. Today her breath came in short, ragged gasps. No, that's impossible, she whispered. She stumbled back, knocking into a mourner. The person didn't react, as if they didn't even notice her. Panic flared in her chest. She turned to the priest, her voice urgent. Excuse me, there must be a mistake. This is my name. This isn't real. The priest continued speaking as if she wasn't there. Hello? Do you hear me? She called louder, desperation creeping into her tone. She reached for his arm, her hand passed through him like mist. She gasped, stumbling back. A wave of vertigo crashed over her. The wind picked up, the whispering voices growing louder, a symphony of unintelligible murmurs. Then, one of the mourners turned their head toward her. Their face was wrong, distorted, eyes too deep, hollow pits that seemed to suck in the light. Clara screamed. She spun to run, but the path out of the cemetery was gone, replaced by an endless row of gravestones stretching into the darkening sky. Her own name was carved onto each and every one. Clara clutched her chest, breath hitching. Her reality was unraveling, warping around her. She turned to the casket again. It was no longer empty. Inside, she saw herself, pale and lifeless. The whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar. Then Clara's breath came in short, sharp gasps as she sprinted from the cemetery. The wind howled behind her, carrying the eerie whispers that still rang in her ears. She didn't dare look back. Her car was exactly where she left it. Hands trembling, she yanked the door open and collapsed into the driver's seat, jamming the key into the ignition. The engine sputtered to life. Without hesitating, she floored the gas pedal, speeding away from the cursed graveyard. As the town's desolate streets stretched before her, she fumbled for her phone. The screen glowed with the no-signal message. She let out a frustrated groan but kept trying, dialing her best friend Mara's number first. It rang and rang. No answer. She tried her parents. No answer. Her hand shook as she gripped the wheel. This wasn't normal. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. Finally, she saw the familiar outline of her apartment complex. Relief flooded her as she parked, rushing inside. Slamming the door shut, she locked it and leaned against it, chest heaving. The familiar space felt foreign, off in a way she couldn't pinpoint. The air was too still. The shadows in the corners stretched just a little too far. She needed to see herself, to confirm she was real. With hurried steps, she crossed to the bathroom and flicked on the light. Her reflection stared back at her from the mirror, pale and wide-eyed. She let out a breath, pressing her hands to the cold sink. I'm real. I'm here. But then, a flicker. A tiny, imperceptible lag between her movement and the reflection's response. Clara's stomach clenched. She lifted a trembling hand, waving. The reflection copied her, but a fraction of a second too late. She froze, heart hammering. Then, the reflection smiled. Clara did not. Her breath caught in her throat. Her own mirrored face stared at her with an expression she wasn't making. She staggered backward, shaking her head. No, this is a trick. I'm imagining this. The light above her flickered. When she looked again, the reflection was normal. Her hands clenched into fists. She couldn't stay here. She had to go back. Had to understand what was happening. Clara stood at the cemetery gates, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The place should have been empty. The funeral should have ended hours ago. But it hadn't. The mourners were still there, standing in the exact same positions, the priest still murmuring his impossible prayer. Clara's skin crawled. It was as if time had folded in on itself. She moved closer, trying to listen. The language they spoke was still foreign, thick with an ancient cadence. But now, she swore she could hear her own name woven into the words. Then, one of the mourners turned their head toward her. Their hollow, pit-like eyes met hers. The whispers surged, louder, overlapping, overwhelming. Clara stumbled back. She had to leave. She had to get out of this town. She drove as fast as she could, the town disappearing in the rearview mirror. The road stretched endlessly before her, winding through the trees. Then the cemetery gates loomed ahead. She slammed on the brakes, her heart pounding. This wasn't possible. She had just left. Clara spun the car around and floored the gas pedal again, gripping the wheel so hard her knuckles turned white. Minutes later, the cemetery reappeared. A loop. No matter which road she took, which turn she made, it always led her back to the cemetery. She screamed in frustration, slamming her fists against the steering wheel. Desperate for answers, she found herself in the town's small library, dust-covered and forgotten by time. The smell of old paper and decay hung in the air as she sifted through newspaper archives. Then she found it. A brittle, yellowed newspaper from decades ago. Local woman vanishes without a trace. The grainy black and white photo beneath the headline made Clara's blood run cold. It was her. Or rather, someone who looked exactly like her. She scanned the article, breath catching on key details. The woman had been last seen near the cemetery. The funeral had been held in her honor, despite the absence of a body. Clara's fingers trembled as she traced the words. Her face was in an article from decades ago. How? A slow, suffocating realization sank into her chest. This wasn't just happening to her. It had happened before. She returned to the cemetery, determination overriding her fear. The mourners were waiting for her now. And this time, when she stepped onto the grounds, they turned toward her in unison. A hush fell over the crowd. The priest stepped forward, his eyes locking onto hers. When he spoke, his voice was no longer foreign. It was clear, crisp, familiar. You've been gone a long time, Evelyn. Clara stiffened. Evelyn. That wasn't her name. No, she whispered, shaking her head. My name is Clara. The mourners shook their heads in eerie unison. The priest smiled, sorrowful. No, my dear. You died long ago. Clara's world shattered. She staggered back, the weight of the truth pressing against her chest, threatening to crush her. The whispers rose again, echoing her name, both names, as reality itself began to warp around her. The headstones shifted, the casket's lid creaked open once more. Inside, the body stirred, and this time it opened its eyes. Clara wandered through the town's empty streets, her mind a tangled mess of fear, and confusion. The priest's words echoed in her skull. You died long ago. It couldn't be true. It wasn't true. But the newspaper article, the funeral, the mourners calling her by another name, nothing made sense anymore. The town felt different now, like a place that had never truly existed, suspended between life and death. The air carried a weight, a hush that swallowed sound. Even her own footsteps seemed muffled. She didn't know where she was going, but something guided her deeper into the forgotten parts of town, where the roads cracked with neglect and the buildings stood like hollowed-out corpses. Then she saw it, an abandoned house at the end of a lonely street, its windows dark and shattered, its door hanging open as if expecting her. A wave of nausea rolled through her, but her feet carried her forward. The wooden steps creaked beneath her weight as she entered. Dust floated in the stale air, the scent of rot clinging to the walls. Inside, the house was eerily preserved, as though someone had lived here once and simply vanished. The furniture was covered in sheets, their shapes distorted like shrouded figures. And then she saw them, the photographs. They littered the walls, scattered across tables, some stuffed into broken frames. Her breath hitched. They were all of her. But they weren't recent. They were old, yellowed with age, their edges curled as if handled too many times. Some were ripped, others stained, and yet every single one depicted her face. In some, she was smiling. In others, she looked distant, staring at something unseen. Her fingers trembled as she picked one up. The back was marked with a date, March 2nd, 1978. Clara's blood ran cold. That was impossible. That was decades before she was born. The floor creaked behind her. She spun, her heart hammering. A man stood in the doorway, watching her. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken but filled with something unreadable. He looked familiar, but she couldn't place him. He stepped forward cautiously, his voice barely above a whisper. I was wondering when you'd come back. Clara swallowed, her throat dry. Who are you? The man exhaled slowly, as if the words he was about to say carried an unbearable weight. I'm your brother. Clara took a step back. No, that's not possible. She had no siblings. She was an only child. She knew she was. But something in his gaze, an aching sadness, a longing, made her hesitate. You don't remember, do you? His voice was pained. Evelyn. She stiffened at the name. It didn't belong to her, but the way he said it, it felt like it should. He sighed, glancing at the photographs. You died, he said, almost gently. A long time ago. There was an accident. A car crash. I was with you when it happened. His voice broke on the last words, and for a moment, he looked like a man weighed down by grief, so heavy it had never left him. Clara shook her head violently. No, that's not true. I'm here. I'm alive. He didn't argue. He only studied her, his expression unreadable. Something's keeping you here, he murmured. Something you haven't finished. The words sent a shiver through her. As if on cue, the air in the house shifted. A whisper rippled through the room. Not from him, not from her, but from everywhere. Clara's eyes darted around. The house seemed to darken, the shadow stretching, twisting. From the corner of her vision, movement. Figures. Standing in the dim recesses of the house, their forms barely solid. Watching. Whispering. She staggered backward, her chest tightening. Who are they? She gasped. Her supposed brother's face darkened. They're waiting. For what? His answer came like a blade to the gut. For you. A strangled breath left Clara's lips. The figures, dozens of them, faceless but familiar, stood still, murmuring to one another. Their voices bled together, one phrase rising above the rest. Unfinished business. Clara's knees weakened. The room seemed to tilt. Her pulse pounded, a frantic drumbeat against her ribs, until she realized something horrifying. It was slowing. A cold, creeping numbness spread through her limbs. She looked down at her hands. Her skin had paled, a sickly, translucent hue creeping in. Her veins darkened beneath the surface, like ink seeping through paper. She lifted trembling fingers to her wrist, searching desperately for a pulse. It was faint, weak, fading. Her breath hitched. What's happening to me? Her brother, If that's who he really was, watched her with sorrow. "You're remembering." No, this isn't real," she whispered, but her voice came out wrong, thin, distant, as though it didn't fully belong to her anymore. Her skin felt loose, like it was shrinking. The air pressed against her chest, suffocating. She took a step forward, but her knees buckled. She barely caught herself against the table. Her fingers grazed the newspaper clippings scattered across it, and something in her mind cracked. Images flooded her. A night road, rain pouring in sheets, headlights cutting through the dark. Laughter, her laughter, mixed with her brother's voice. A sudden, blinding flash. Metal screaming, glass shattering, pain, cold, silence. The memory hit her like a freight train, forcing her to her knees. The accident, the crash. She had died. The whispering grew louder, circling her like a swarm. The ghostly figures stepped closer. Clara's breath came in shallow gasps. She could feel herself slipping, her body no longer fully here. The town, the house, the photographs, it was all a construct, a place caught between worlds. And she was part of it. Her brother knelt beside her, gripping her shoulders. "You have to let go," he said, urgency creeping into his voice. But Clara couldn't. Some part of her still refused to accept it. And the town wasn't letting her go. Not yet. The town had become a shifting labyrinth of flickering streetlights and endless roads folding in on themselves. Clara ran, her breath ragged, her pulse barely there. But no matter how far she went, she always ended up back at the cemetery. The gravestone stretched endlessly into the void, her name carved into each one, mocking her. The wind carried whispers that no longer felt like separate voices, but one singular entity pressing into her mind, whispering the truth she didn't want to face. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to exist anymore. The sky above cracked like shattered glass, revealing a vast, endless blackness beyond. The buildings around her flickered in and out of existence, like a dying signal struggling to hold on to form. The streets bled away into nothingness, and with them, the town's illusions crumbled. She saw flashes of her life, or what she thought was her life, flickering between the dissolving structures. Her apartment, the places she used to frequent, the people she once loved. But they were distortions, echoes of memories long detached from time. They twisted and warped before disintegrating into dust. Clara clutched her head, nausea rolling through her as the weight of truth pressed down on her chest. She had been reliving this day, over and over. Every time she reached the funeral, reality reset. The same mourners, the same empty casket, the same whispers calling her name. How many times had she stood in that cemetery? How many times had she seen her own gravestone? The thought made her stomach turn. A cold voice broke through the chaos. "You understand now." She turned sharply. The priest stood in the middle of the disintegrating town, untouched by the swirling darkness consuming everything. His black robes flowed unnaturally, as though they were part of the void itself. His face, now more shadow than flesh, twisted into something unreadable. The wind around him was silent, an eerie stillness contrasting the madness unraveling behind him. Clara's throat tightened. "What is this place?" "A limbo," the priest said. His voice echoed unnaturally, layered, as though multiple versions of him spoke at once. "A place for those who refuse to move on. For souls like yours, clinging to a past that no longer exists." She shook her head, stepping back, but the ground beneath her cracked like thin ice. "No, I didn't ask to be here." The priest took a step forward, the void shifting with him. "And yet, you return, over and over, trapped in the cycle of your own denial." A bitter laugh escaped her lips, despite the fear clawing at her. "So, what? You're some kind of grim reaper." "I am a keeper of lost souls," he corrected. "A guide for those who stand at the threshold between life and what comes after." He tilted his head, studying her. "You were given a funeral, Clara. But a funeral is not just for the dead. It is for the living, to grieve, to let go. And yet, you linger." Clara clenched her fists. "Because this isn't fair," she shouted. "I didn't choose to die. I didn't get to say goodbye. One moment, I was alive, and the next, I was this." She gestured at herself, at the unraveling world around them. How am I supposed to just accept that? The priest's gaze darkened. You misunderstand. He lifted a hand, and suddenly Clara felt something shift inside her. A cold realization sank into her bones. She had chosen this. Not in the way she thought, not consciously, but she had made a decision long ago without realizing it. Every time she refused to believe, every time she ran from the truth, she had kept herself here. She had clung to her name, her face, her existence, refusing to let go. In this place, this twisted, decaying version of reality had become her prison. The cemetery flickered into view again, the final thread of this illusion holding strong. The mourners, still trapped in their endless loop, stood around the grave. The wind carried the echoes of prayers in a language she would never understand. The casket remained open, waiting. The priest gestured toward it. One final choice remains. Clara's breath came in shallow gasps. Step forward, accept what has already happened, and move on. Or remain. His voice grew colder, heavier. Remain in the cycle, reliving your funeral. Again, and again, and again. The weight of it crashed down on her, suffocating. The sky above twisted, the shadows creeping closer, dragging the town further into oblivion. This was it, her last chance to break free. Her legs trembled as she took a step forward. Then another. The casket loomed before her, empty yet waiting. A shuddering breath left her lips as she looked inside, and saw herself. The lifeless version of her lay still, eyes closed, hands folded peacefully. There was no horror in that face, no terror, only acceptance. It wasn't grotesque or nightmarish. It was quiet, a truth that had always been waiting for her to see it. Her heartbeat, faint, weak, slowed even more. The whispers became softer. The cycle could end, but only if she let it. The memories returned in a violent flood, tearing through Clara's mind with merciless clarity. The dark road slick with rain, the blinding headlights of an oncoming truck, the sickening crunch of metal twisting upon impact. She had been driving that night, lost in thought, her mind elsewhere, anywhere but the present. The moment had been quick, merciless, a blink between life and death. She staggered backward, gasping as the weight of it crushed her chest. The accident had stolen everything from her. Her future, her dreams, her very existence. But she had refused to see it. She had buried the truth, cocooned herself in the illusion that she was still alive. That she had simply taken a wrong turn and wandered into something strange, something unnatural. But the real horror wasn't the funeral, the mourners, or the unraveling town. The horror was that she had done this to herself. The chanting grew louder, rising like a storm around her. The mourners stood in a perfect circle now, their faces still blurred, their mouths moving in rhythmic unison. They were not strangers. They were remnants, echoes of those she had left behind, fragments of grief given form. And they were calling for her. Her name rolled from their lips like a prayer. The priest stood beside the open casket, his dark eyes watching her with neither malice nor sympathy. His presence was absolute, an immovable force standing at the crossroads of her fate. You must decide, he intoned, his voice reverberating through the collapsing town. Clara's breath shuddered as she looked around. The sky above was splitting apart, jagged cracks exposing an abyss beyond. The buildings melted into shadow, entire streets swallowed into nothingness. There was no escape, no road to take, only this moment. She turned back to the casket, staring at her own still form. Her body was untouched, peaceful, as though simply waiting for her. If she stepped inside, if she accepted what had already happened, she could be free. The voices would fade, the nightmare would end, and whatever lay beyond this existence would finally reveal itself. The warm glow of something unseen shimmered at the edges of her vision, beckoning, promising peace. But the other option, the other choice, was still there. She could reject it. She could fight. She could deny the truth and hold onto the fragile threads of whatever was left of her consciousness. But what would that mean? She already knew. The funeral would begin again. She would wake up on that lonely highway, stumble upon the same mourners, stare in horror at the same gravestone. Over and over. Forever. Her fingers trembled at her sides. The priest watched her, waiting. The casket remained open. She had to choose.
Don't forget to tell your horror experience in comment. Subscribe our channels for more scary and horror stories.